But one of the big fears about this move to isolate the United States that tariffs really put the US economy on is that countries like China are going to begin to de-dollarize. That fear was put out into the public by the Western mainstream media as these tariffs ratcheted up against China and stayed on China even while Trump supposedly said. First of all, talk about how tariffs impact this de-dollarization trend. And what does it mean for the broader world economic order that the U.S. sits in right now, as you have stated, as a declining empire?
Well, I think for a long time, the dollar has been declining in what it means to people long before Mr. Trump, either his first or his second tour in the White House. The dollar is part of the arrangements made at the end of World War II in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. It was the organization in those meetings up there in that hotel at the end of World War II. It was the architecture of the global economy that was being constructed by the victorious powers, the United States, Britain, France, and so on. And since all of the others were destroyed economically, if not militarily, it was the dollar that became the dominant new currency. Very simply, it replaced the British pound sterling, which had been the world currency, or as close to that as you could be in those days. Because of the British Empire, it became the dominant currency. And when the British Empire gave way to the American, which was done by the World Wars I and II, the British disappear as a world power and the Americans take their place, so did the dollar. But this was a bizarre circumstance. Germany, Japan would begin immediately to try to rebuild what had been destroyed in World War II. And by the 1960s and 70s, 20 years later, they had done it. And other countries began to follow suit. Now, the empires of those countries were gone, so they couldn't do it as quickly. France never could come back. Belgium never could. Britain never could. But the United States kind of took off and became the dominant player, and with it, the dollar. But as other countries rose up, they had to compete with the United States as the dominant player. And so the relationships, anybody thinking about it would have said it, the relationships of the United States as dominant and the rest of the Europeans as compliant junior partners, that would dissolve. And NATO, as their organization, would dissolve with it. Too many competing interests. And that was before it was clear that the one country that could really come back from the devastation of World War II was China, which had not been expected. The poor were supposed to stay poor, as indeed most of the rest of the world has done. But the Chinese didn't agree. And the Chinese turned out to be able to change all of that. Well, once you do that, and once you have it, not only the Chinese doing it for themselves, but being so carefully and successfully able to create an alliance, the BRICS, that is durable and growing and deepening the connections among them, well, then, wow, you are watching a process in which all the conditions for a decline of the dollar are present. And this is not about some kind of aggressive policy on the part of China. There could be such a policy, but they haven't chosen to pursue it. They're simply developing their own networks of buying and selling. And for those networks, the dollar is still convenient. They still use it. But the actions of the United States, not their actions, are making the dollar less attractive for them to use. You don't know what's going to happen to the dollar because of the interventions of the American government. Look, the dollar is down against the euro by 10% from the day that Mr. Trump became president to now. Now, what in the world is going on? That's not to be a 10% in a 3-month period. That's as dramatic in foreign exchange as what Michael told us about the stock market changing 4% in 2 days. These are crazy movements. And you don't know who the United States government is going to decide to sanction. Remember that tariffs is one way of whacking the world. Sanctions is another way. And there are half a dozen countries or more that are now sanctioned. The United States is the #1 sanctioning power. No other country comes close. So the United States is giving reasons by these actions and by the up and down, herky-jerky rise and fall to boot of these actions. So you'll make the dollar less and less. Why would you use it? Its value is uncertain. Its vulnerability for you is uncertain. You don't want to do that. It's much better to trade with and to deal with less insecure elements of your exchange relationships. And so the dollar is less desirable, but it's not just the dollar. They're looking for export markets outside the United States because the one here is too risky. They're looking for imports from other parts of the world because those from the United States are too risky. You know, people think there's no cost to invoking national security, something Michael mentioned a few moments ago. But that's a very dangerous game to play. If you use that very loosely, then nobody knows when it will be used against them. You know, the libertarian ideology, which is experiencing, for me anyway, a very welcome death these days. The notion that the world is run by good and bad governments, and everything bad is because the government intervenes, and everything good is when you privatize. We are watching the United States take a hatchet to that idea. Look at the government intervention. You know, this way, that way, one way, this way in the morning and that way in the afternoon. This is now a governmental interventionist economic system. And the ideology of libertarianism is flipped out the window. It was never more than a gloss on the free trade idea, which the United States could benefit from when it was the only game in town after World War II. Now that it's not the only game in town, free trade is out the window, neoliberalism is out the window, and the libertarian ideology that piggybacked off of it, it's out the window too.
Well, Richard said the magic words. Why would other countries want to use the dollar? President Trump has said his intention is to steadily lower the dollar's exchange rate. The purpose, he said, is so we can make American industrial exports cheaper. As the dollar goes down, other countries don't have to pay as much. Well, so it'll make an industry manufactured export cheaper if the United States had manufactured products to export, which it doesn't have. And that's what's so bizarre. His logic of making, having a lower dollar, that somehow that's going to help the trade balance. And it's really not about the trade balance at all. Especially Vice President Vance has said, well, we don't want other countries to support the dollar's exchange rate by buying more treasury securities and buying more American investments. And so President Trump has said, we're going to put a tariff on foreign purchases of bonds and stocks here. So they're going to have to pay, let's say, 5% tariff. Well, if bonds don't even yield 5% per year, that means any foreign investor in the United States is going to lose money on its investment as the dollar goes down, lowering the value of dollars in foreign currency. And at the same time, when the dollar goes down, that means that American multinational firms that have affiliates in Europe, all of a sudden, whatever earnings their affiliates are able to make in Europe or countries whose currency doesn't go down, are going to be much more valuable than the United States. And so this is going to encourage yet more investment outflow. But I want to say another comment based on what Richard began to say. What we're seeing in China's industrial takeoff isn't simply a market phenomenon of manufacturing efficiency. It's not simply that they organize their factories better and invest more in research and development. It's a conflict of social systems. What makes China so much more competitive than the West is it's a socialist economy where the government picks up a lot of the costs of education, of communication, transportation in its high-speed railroads that are actually run at a loss so that it can provide railway transport less expensively. Richard before mentioned the GDPs of China versus the G7. Well, the GDPs of the G7 include all of these costs of privatized natural monopolies that have been taken out of the hands of government, all the economic rents that they're making, all the high prices and monopoly rents they're making is counted as GDP. China doesn't do that because China provides these basic services, communications, transportation, healthcare, education, at a subsidized rate. Their GDP doesn't include this increase in financial and insurance and economic rent charges that the West has. And that's what makes these other economies, China's economy and other economies that choose to take the socialist route, so much more efficient than the West. And it's the fact that there's a conflict of economic systems that is what makes the United States designate China as the enemy, because the United States, as Richard said, is neoliberal. It's in privatization. You're seeing Mr. Musk carve up the government, get rid of government, privatize everything, sell off the government post office and privatize it. Obviously, rents, mail is going to be more expensive. We're having two opposite systems. One is a system of economic war of the monopolists and the 1% that are privatizing all of the investment on productive capacity in their own hands. And the other is China that is trying to use its economic surplus to increase living standards and productivity.
Professor Wolff, I want you to follow up with this because this gets to think when Michael talks about privatization, slash and burn everything. This has global ramifications in the sense that, well, then what does the United States actually have to offer? We just saw Japan get into disastrous negotiations as the first country around this reciprocal tariff business. And even the Prime Minister of Japan, one of the most compliant countries to the United States, is saying they can't just take concessions. And actually, Chas Freeman, a former diplomat, he said that the United States offered nothing. And so what exactly then are the cards that the U.S. has to play in this trade war that seems to be imploding right now? And Michael, I think, gave a good foundation as to why that is. But your thoughts?
Well, I mean, the weapon of the United States is the fact that it's a wealthy market and that the president is letting the Japanese, for example, and many others, let them know that we are prepared now to weaponize that. We are, whatever lip service we give to libertarianism, that's all it is. It's lip service. We will use it when it's a convenient rationale, as when you fire public employees. You make a nonsense argument that this is an exercise in efficiency, Or you make an even more nonsense argument that this privatization will somehow improve the situation out of a notion that the private is somehow always better because profit drives you to behave better than any other motivation might. These are dying arguments. They don't apply anymore. Most of what's going on now is active government intervention, which directly violates the notions of privatization, efficiency, and all of the rest of it. So you're watching a naked use of the wealth of the United States. The Japanese need to sell cars in the United States. They already produce many of them here because at earlier times, I don't know if people know this, but back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the United States imposed quotas on the Japanese. The way it worked was no tariff, but you couldn't bring more than X 100,000 Japanese vehicles to the United States in a calendar year. That's another way of protecting GM, Ford, and at that time Chrysler. Well, now it's being done by the tariff threat. Already the Japanese produce many of their cars here inside the United States. I'm sure that that's part of the goal of doing that. But as Michael just alluded to, American wages being what they are, and the cost of business in this country being what it is, especially because so much of those costs is not socialized, not done cheaply by the government, but rather expensively by the private profit makers who run it. Your cars are going to have to cost a great deal more money. And that opens up the whole danger of an inflation coming out of all of this, which is simply put behind some sort of curtain. So we're supposed to discuss it as if this were not the case. And the rest of the world looks at all of this and, sees it as crazy, but has to take care of its own business first, which is not to take the blow of being told that your American market is no longer going to generate the profits that you're used to, that you've been used to for 20 years. This is all being taken away from you. That's Mr. Trump's objective. His real goal, he dare not say it, but his real goal is that producers in other countries, Japan and any other country, will be so horrified by the loss of sales in the United States now that Americans will have to pay Uncle Sam a tariff on top of the price of the item, that they're going to lower the prices of what they sell as a way to make the net effect of a tariff less than if it was just added to their unchanged price. In other words, they're going to absorb the pain of compensating for the American tariff. And that makes them angry because it's clear that this is advantaging the United States at their expense, straight out. And they're going to yell about the private capitalists in Japan are going to the Japanese government and saying, hey, you're our government. We pay you taxes. Do something. Make this problem go away. We can't, we're making an 8% profit. With a 10% tariff, we're done. We're not going to make any profit at all. And if that happens, we're going to lay off 50,000 workers. And if that happens, you're going to lose the next election. I mean, this is not a polite conversation. And Mr. Trump imagines that he's in a position to impose this much pain on so many countries who will therefore just lie down, roll over, and do what they're told. We're not there anymore. It's too late for that. And the denial of that is in the end holding back the policy recognition. If we had a real opposition in this country, an opposition party, they would be going to town with all of this. Instead, we have a Democratic Party which is brain dead. which has nothing to say, which is waiting for Mr. Trump to implode, which, by the way, may work. He may do so much damage and bring down so much trouble that an exhausted country will vote for the Democrats, not because they're better, but because this has proven itself to be awful. Even the people I like, the Bernie Sanders or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, to lambaste the billionaire, I mean, I'm in favor of that. We shouldn't have them. But that's the least that could and should be said about the situation we're in.
Well, when you talk about European exporters having a choice of, gee, are we going to have to lower the price of what we're selling in order to keep the U.S. market? China is pretty immune from a lot of that because there really isn't any U.S. competition for many of the products that China is exporting. And in fact, the real strategy at work, I think, that Trump is talking about is not in manufactured products that are interchangeable. Europe, China, and America can all make cars. Maybe China does them cheaper, but at least they're making the same product. But America is trying to concentrate its power in high-tech information sector monopoly and computer chips and the whole electronic revolution. And Trump thinks if we can deny China the ability to rival us technologically, to be able to make products that compete with us, then it doesn't matter what international prices or tariffs are, because whether tariffs increase prices or not, the countries that import these absolutely necessary goods, whether it's computer chips or food or whatever, they're going to have to pay whatever the supplier charges, whatever, because they're a monopoly good. So the United States is trying to monopolize whatever sectors it can in high technology, information technology, so that it can suddenly threaten to sanction other countries. Like in the 1950s, after Mao's revolution in China, the United States tried to boycott food exports to China to starve it out. Well, they can't use American agriculture to starve out other countries anymore, but Trump is hoping that he can use information technology to starve out other countries, to make it impossible for them to use computerized or internet transportation, if he can only get other countries to sanction them. So all of a sudden, we're, again, not in the sphere of tariffs for price competitiveness. It's tariffs to be weaponized to destabilize the trade, especially of Europe and maybe a few other Asian countries, in order for them to boycott and sanction China so that it cannot become a rival in exporting those products that the United States wants to monopolize. So instead of the labor theory of value underlying international costs and trade, we have a rent theory of international trade. What can you, how many products can you monopolize to impose monopoly rent charges on your clients because you've blocked them from being able to produce competing products?
Yeah, this is very important because that would be a logical strategy if they could do it. I don't think they can do it, but yes, it's a logical strategy that, if you have a monopoly on something that everybody who manufactures anything has to have, computer managed production, well, then what the United States can do is siphon the surplus, the profits, out of everybody else in the world. Let manufacturing be done in China. but they'll have to pay such enormous fees, monopoly fees, to use the technology that the profit they make from their manufacturing will all be lost in the exaggerated monopoly prices they have to pay for their technological inputs. That, in a way, that's the British Empire. It survived in London because it could be the place where you go for the financing and the insurance for what everybody else in the world was producing and shipping from one corner of the world to the other, but they had to pay an insurance company in London, and they were in a position to siphon, not all of it, but to siphon a huge part of the world's wealth so that London could be, a playground for rich people in the way that New York has become too. And there's this hope that maybe you could salvage, and it would be an enclave America, because there isn't enough of this going to happen, especially now that the Chinese have demonstrated that they're very good at the high-tech stuff anyway. But there'll still be the ability to siphon enough to make for very wealthy suburbs of New York and Washington and Chicago and LA and all of that. And the rest of the country will be a mass of desperate poverty, which is a direction we seem to be going anyway. That's a conceivable thing,
yeah.
Although the desperate situation of Europe, which will become more desperate now, argues that they may, in the end, begin to realize that they have to do something to avoid being shunted into irrelevance between the Chinese on one end and the United States on the other.